Dawn
Rosie!
always broke soft and pale over Willow Creek Ranch, stretching gold across the hills and throwing long shadows behind the old split-rail fences.
It's okay, girl. We're right here.
The cattle had started bawling
You're not
before the
alone.
sun even made it over the ridge, impatient for feed.
Come on,
And
Rosie,
the wind
one more
carried
push.
the sharp, earthy
He's
smell of
here.
hay and
He's
summer
really
dust.
here.
Most mornings, the ranch woke up slow, but inside the weathered farmhouse, Margaret was already up, her hands moving steady and sure
Let her
as
go,
she tied
son.
her gray-streaked hair into a knot.
She's got Rosie's heart.
Jack watched his mother from the doorway, boots in one hand, his hat in the other. The years had carved fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but there was nothing soft about Margaret's voice or the way she managed the ranch. Willow Creek was her life's work, 100 acres of tough ground and good grass, built back up after drought, fire, and more than one lean season. Jack, her only son, had grown up in the saddle, and though he stood over 6 feet now, broad-shouldered and silent as his father once was, he still deferred to his mother's glance. "Eggs'll be cold if you don't sit down," Margaret called, pouring coffee so strong you could float a horseshoe in it. Jack slid into his seat and set his hat on the table. He didn't say much, and she didn't expect it. They ate with the hush of people who'd worked together too long to need words. Then Jack stood, pulled on his boots, and with a nod, went out to the barn. The sky was streaked pink and lavender, the horses restless and snorting in the cool. He paused by the big copper mare, Rosie, leaning his cheek against her neck. She flicked her ears and pressed into his touch. There was something about Rosie, the burnished red of her coat, the way she always seemed to sense Jack's mood. He'd raised her himself, from a half-wild filly nobody else could get close to, and their bond ran deeper than most folks understood. When things got rough, it was Rosie who'd wait at the fence, watching with liquid brown eyes, a steady presence in a world that changed too fast. "Morning, girl," Jack murmured, raking his fingers through her mane. Rosie snorted, lips twitching at his shirt pocket for the treat he always brought. Jack laughed quietly and slipped her an apple slice, watching the way she nuzzled his palm. The barn was full of the usual sounds: swish of tails, low nickers, Margaret's collie barking at the chickens. Jack moved through the chores in a practiced rhythm: hay for the geldings, grain for the broodmares, checking hooves and eyes, smoothing a hand down Rosie's back as he passed. He could do this blindfolded, but he never rushed with Rosie. She was the heart of the ranch, the pride of Willow Creek, and everyone knew it. Margaret came out with her ledger, ticking off feed orders and cattle weights, her boots crunching in the straw. She watched Jack and Rosie with a quiet fondness that she rarely spoke aloud. "She's looking good," Margaret observed, running a critical eye over the mare. "That shine on her coat's something else." Jack grinned, his face breaking into the open, boyish smile he reserved for horses and dogs. "Told you she'd bounce back after the winter. Just needed some extra oats." Margaret's look softened, but she couldn't quite hide the shadow behind her smile. The last few years had been hard. Cattle prices dropping, 2 springs of flood, and 1 dry summer that nearly did them in. They'd lost half their hay crop and patched the barn roof themselves. Neighbors talked about selling out, moving to town, but Margaret wouldn't hear of it. "Hardest part's over," she said, maybe to herself. They worked side by side until noon, fixing a broken gate and sorting feed in the shed. Jack listened to the radio crackle with weather reports, thinking how lucky they were. Lucky to have Rosie, lucky to still have the ranch. He wiped sweat from his brow and headed back toward the barn, but stopped short at the sound of laughter. His younger cousin Lila, just home from college for the summer, sat on the fence rail, swinging her boots and watching the horses. "Jack, you treating Rosie like royalty again?" she teased. "Only way she'll tolerate me," Jack replied, but his eyes were gentle. Lila hopped down, brushing sawdust from her jeans. She was smart as a whip, always talking about big city dreams, but out here she relaxed, the hard edges melting away. "Think she remembers when you tried to teach her to bow?" Lila giggled. Rosie whickered as if in reply, nipping Jack's sleeve. Jack flushed. "Yeah, she's still got more dignity than I ever will." They laughed, the sound bouncing off the barn walls. Even Margaret smiled, leaning on the fence with her arms folded. As the sun climbed high, the ranch came alive with its own peculiar rhythm. Hired hands moved cattle to the upper pasture. Lila helped muck stalls, and Margaret ran errands in town. But Jack stayed close to the barn, always circling back to Rosie. He brushed her coat until it gleamed, picked burrs from her tail, whispered secrets into her ear. It was in these quiet moments that the weight of the world seemed lighter, the future less uncertain. As dusk painted the sky gold and indigo, Jack leaned against the fence and watched Rosie grazing, her mane tossing in the breeze. The shadows lengthened across the yard, and Margaret's voice floated from the porch. "Jack, supper!" He gave Rosie one last pat and turned for home. Inside, the old house glowed with lamplight, and the scent of roasting chicken filled the air. The day ended, as it always did. Jack, Margaret, and Lila gathered around the battered kitchen table, the dog snoring at their feet, the ranch quiet for another night. No one said it aloud, but each of them knew it. Willow Creek wasn't just land or livestock. It was memory, hope, and everything they'd ever fought for. And at the heart of it all was Rosie, the copper mare whose story, unbeknownst to them, was only just beginning. The air was already warming when Dr. Clayton's old blue pickup rumbled down the lane, trailing a cloud of dust. Jack noticed him first, pausing from hauling water buckets. He raised a hand in greeting. But something about the vet's hunched shoulders made him frown. Dr. Clayton was as much a fixture in these parts as the mountains themselves, a man who'd patched up cattle, dogs, and horses for 3 decades, whose word everyone trusted. Margaret came out onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron. "Morning, Doc," she called, her tone light but her eyes watchful. "Morning, Margaret. Jack." Dr. Clayton nodded, forcing a smile. He was a sturdy man with a trimmed mustache and gentle eyes. But today, he seemed weighed down. Rosie, as if she sensed the commotion, lifted her head from the grass and pricked her ears. Jack led her out to the paddock fence, brushing a reassuring hand along her neck. Rosie nudged him, soft and trusting. Dr. Clayton gave Rosie a quick once-over, running a practiced hand along her back, then down to her flank. "You say she's been sluggish?" he asked, squinting at Margaret. "She's eating well enough, just a little off," Margaret replied, concern flickering in her voice. "Jack says she's been lying down more than usual." The vet grunted, pulling out his stethoscope and crouching to listen to Rosie's heartbeat. Jack watched, nerves taut as barbed wire. Rosie stood still, flicking her tail, dark eyes calm. Dr. Clayton took his time, listening, moving to check Rosie's gums, then her belly. After a few minutes, he glanced at Jack. "She's still young, but you ever notice anything odd? Trouble getting up, breathing hard, swelling?" Jack shook his head. "Nothing like that." The vet nodded, but his frown deepened. "I'd like to do a quick ultrasound just to be sure." Margaret and Jack exchanged a worried glance. Dr. Clayton disappeared to his truck, returning with a portable scanner. He set it up, squirted gel on Rosie's side, and pressed the wand gently to her belly. The machine hummed and beeped, throwing blurry black and white images onto the tiny screen. Jack leaned in, holding Rosie's halter. Margaret stood stiff beside him. The seconds crawled by. Dr. Clayton's brow furrowed as he moved the probe. Finally, he sucked in a sharp breath and let out a shaky exhale. "Well, I'll be..." Margaret's voice was low. "Doc?" Dr. Clayton wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I don't believe it. Rosie's pregnant. But not just pregnant, she's carrying twins." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Jack's jaw dropped. He stared at Rosie, then at the vet, then back again. "Twins? Are you sure?" Dr. Baticha. Clayton nodded, eyes wide with disbelief. "Clear as day. You almost never see twins in horses. It's rare and risky, very risky." Margaret's lips tightened. "How risky?" The vet hesitated. "Most mares can't carry twins to term. One, maybe both foals could die. Worst case, Rosie could lose her life, too." He straightened, shoulders heavy. "The usual advice. Terminate one of the embryos early. Give the other a chance." Jack felt as if the air had gone thin. He looked at Rosie, grazing peacefully. Oblivious to the storm brewing, the idea of choosing which life to save, it twisted his stomach. Margaret's voice was brisk, almost cold. "We'll do what we have to. She's too important." Jack turned sharply. "There's got to be another way. Rosie's strong, Doc. She's always pulled through." Dr. Clayton's eyes softened. "Jack, I know how much she means to you, but you have to think clearly. Mares have died trying to carry twins. Even if she survives, the foals..." He broke off, sighing. "We'd need to act soon." Jack swallowed hard. "Let me think. Please." The three of them stood in tense silence. Even the birds seemed to quiet, the ranch suddenly too still. Margaret stepped forward, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "I know you love her, son, but we can't risk losing Rosie and both foals. The vet's right." Jack looked away, fighting the ache behind his ribs. He felt Rosie nuzzle his arm, warm breath grounding him. He remembered every morning ride, every night he'd spent in the barn through thunder and hail, Rosie standing steady at his side. Lila, drawn by the heavy mood, appeared at the fence, her eyes flicking from Jack to Margaret. "What's wrong?" Margaret explained in a few clipped words. Lila's face paled. "But isn't there a chance? Even a small one?" Dr. Clayton hesitated. "There's a chance, but it's slim." Jack clenched his fists. "Then I want to try. At least talk it over. Rosie deserves that much." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "We'll have a family meeting. Tonight." Dr. Clayton packed up his machine, lingering a moment beside Jack. "Whatever you decide, I'll help you every step of the way." Jack nodded, eyes glued to Rosie. He watched as she moved across the paddock, mane catching the sunlight, as if nothing in her world had changed. That night, after chores and supper, the family gathered in the living room. The radio played low, the dog asleep at Margaret's feet. Jack laid out his case, Rosie's strength, her spirit, the tiny chance that all three could survive. Margaret argued back, logic and love warring in her voice. Lila listened, teary-eyed, hugging her knees. The hours stretched long. The ranch seemed to hold its breath, every old scar and hard-won memory pressing in. At last, they agreed to sleep on it, each wrestling with worry and hope. Jack slipped out to the barn after midnight, flashlight swinging in the dark. He found Rosie standing in her stall, ears pricked. He pressed his forehead to hers, whispering, "We'll find a way, girl. I promise." In the hush of the night, with only Rosie and the stars for company, Jack made up his mind. No matter what, he would fight for her, and for whatever future still waited on the other side of fear. Morning broke heavy and gray, low clouds pressing over Willow Creek Ranch as if echoing the weight in Jack's chest. The kitchen was quiet except for the slow tick of the wall clock. Margaret stirred sugar into her coffee, her gaze distant. Lila picked at her eggs, her appetite gone. Jack sat at the end of the table, hands clenched around his mug, waiting for someone to break the silence. Margaret spoke first. "Jack, I've been up all night thinking, this isn't just about us. Rosie is more than a horse. She's family, but I can't lose her." Jack met his mother's eyes, his voice rough. "I know. I feel the same way, but Rosie's stronger than most mares. I've seen her fight through things that would break any other horse. If we give up on her now, we'll never know what she could do." Lila looked from one to the other. "Can't we at least try? I mean, if she's made it this far with the twins, maybe it's meant to be." Margaret's fingers drummed the table, her face lined with worry. "It's a risk, a big one." Jack nodded. "But it's Rosie's life too. She trusts us to do right by her." After a long moment, Margaret let out a slow breath. "All right, we'll do everything we can for her. But Jack, if the vet says we need to step in if things get bad, you promise you'll listen?" Jack swallowed. "I promise. But until then, we give Rosie every chance." A quiet resolve filled the kitchen, heavy but clear. Margaret called Dr. Clayton that afternoon, her voice steady but tight. He agreed to come by every few days, monitor Rosie, and help with whatever they needed. That evening, Jack went to work transforming the old foaling stall into Rosie's private sanctuary. He lined the floor with fresh straw, repaired the cracked window to keep out drafts, and hung a blanket over the door for warmth. Every detail mattered now. He posted a new feeding schedule on the barn wall. Smaller meals, more often, extra supplements, plenty of water. Jack measured every scoop of grain with surgical care. Margaret cooked Rosie's favorite bran mash with carrots and molasses, and Lila brought apples from the orchard, slicing them thin so Rosie wouldn't choke. As the days passed, Jack started keeping a meticulous log. Rosie's temperature, heart rate, appetite, how much she lay down, every nicker or sigh. The journal's pages filled with scribbled notes and quiet hopes. Margaret teased him that he cared more about Rosie's stats than his own, but Jack just shrugged, a shy smile flickering across his face. Most nights, Jack made a bed of old quilts in the corner of the stall and slept beside Rosie. He read aloud from dog-eared westerns or whispered stories about the first wild mustangs on the prairie. Rosie listened with half-lidded eyes, her great copper head resting near his hand. The barn became their world, a place of soft breathing, flickering lantern light, and the unspoken bond that needed no words. Some nights Jack lay awake, staring at the rafters, doubts gnawing at him. Was he being selfish, risking everything for a miracle? Would Rosie hate him if things went wrong? Each time Rosie would shift, her breath warm on his shoulder, as if reminding him she was still there, still fighting. Margaret watched all this with a complicated pride. She saw how Jack's quiet faith steadied Lila, how it brought the ranch hands together. Old Joe, the foreman, started checking on Rosie first thing every morning, bringing her clover from the upper pasture. Even Dr. Clayton seemed caught up in the momentum, sharing hopeful stories from other farms where the impossible sometimes happened. But not everyone agreed. One afternoon, neighbor Pete stopped by to drop off a bale of hay. He shook his head, his tone sharp. "You're just delaying the inevitable, Jack. Twin pregnancies don't end well. You'd be smarter to cut your losses." Jack's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Maybe, but I'm not ready to quit on her. Not while there's a chance." Pete shrugged, tossing the hay down. "Your ranch, but hope won't pay the vet bills." Jack didn't answer. He watched Pete drive away, then turned back to Rosie, stroking her nose. "You hear that, girl? Not everyone believes in miracles." Rosie nudged his arm, her big brown eyes clear. Jack grinned. "But I do." As spring settled in, the ranch buzzed with quiet anticipation. Word got out in town, first as a whisper, then as gossip at the feed store and church suppers. Some folks called Jack foolish. Others admired his courage. A few even offered to help, sending sacks of feed or spare blankets for the foaling stall. One windy afternoon, Lila returned from town carrying a painted wooden plaque. She nailed it above Rosie's stall. In neat, looping script, it read, "Where there's hope, there's home." Jack smiled every time he saw it. Hope was all they had, and it was enough to keep going day after day, even as the world held its breath. In the evenings, the family gathered around Rosie, sometimes just sitting in silence, sometimes singing old cowboy ballads. It felt like the ranch itself was drawing tighter, pulling together against the storm they all knew was coming. Jack knew things could go wrong. He wasn't naive. But as he watched Rosie doze, her belly round and heavy, he felt a stubborn flicker inside him. Some stories were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. And for the first time in weeks, as the moon rose high over Willow Creek, Jack allowed himself to dream, not just of survival, but of miracles. The spring rains came early that year, turning Willow Creek's dusty pastures into a patchwork of green and gold. Wildflowers blanketed the hills, and the river rushed higher than Jack had seen in years. But beauty could not mask the undercurrent of worry that ran through the ranch, touching every daily rhythm with quiet anxiety. Rosie's pregnancy was growing harder by the week. At first, the changes were small. She slowed a bit on their morning walks, her breath coming faster when she climbed the gentle slope behind the barn. Jack noticed, but said nothing, hoping it was just the weight of her growing belly. He trimmed her hooves himself, talking softly as he worked, trying to chase away the worry that clung to him. Margaret watched, her brow furrowed, as Rosie began picking at her hay, leaving half her feed untouched. The old mare who once danced across the paddock now stood still for hours, head low, tail swishing only half-heartedly at the flies. Jack started keeping more detailed notes in his journal, charting every bite of food, every restless night. One evening, after supper, Jack lingered in the barn. Rain tapped steadily on the tin roof. He pulled Rosie's blanket up over her back and leaned against the stall door, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. Lila appeared, a flashlight in hand. "She's not herself, is she?" Jack shook his head. "No, but she's still trying." Lila slipped inside, laying a gentle hand on Rosie's neck. "So are you." Jack gave a wan smile. "I just wish I could do more." It was on a night thick with storm clouds that trouble truly arrived. The sky rumbled with thunder as lightning flashed along the horizon, casting the ranch in a flickering, unnatural glow. Jack woke in his bed to the sound of pounding rain and something else, a distant, frantic whinny. He bolted upright, heart pounding. Rosie. Jack threw on his boots, grabbing his coat as he dashed through the hallway. Margaret met him at the door, eyes wide with alarm. "It's Rosie." He nodded, already out into the downpour, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly over puddles. The barn loomed ahead, door swinging open in the wind. Inside, chaos. Horses shifted nervously in their stalls, eyes wide with fear from the storm. But it was Rosie who drew Jack's attention. Her legs splayed, body trembling, sides heaving as she struggled to stay upright in the slick mud near the paddock gate. Her copper coat was plastered with rain and grime. Jack's heart lurched. "No, Rosie, hold on!" He scrambled to her side, sliding on the muddy ground. Rosie's breaths came in sharp, shallow bursts. Margaret and Lila followed, soaked through, faces drawn with fear. Margaret dropped to her knees beside Jack, her hands moving with desperate precision, checking Rosie's pulse, feeling for injuries. Jack cupped Rosie's head, stroking her ears. "It's okay, girl. I'm here." The rain pounded harder, thunder shaking the barn walls. Lila ran to fetch blankets, and Margaret called Dr. Clayton, her voice almost lost in the howl of the wind. Old Joe arrived, wild-eyed, helping them rig a sling from fence posts and baling twine to help Rosie stand. For endless minutes, they fought the storm and the mud, shouting over the wind, coaxing Rosie to rise. Jack whispered to her, sang old cowboy lullabies through chattering teeth, his voice hoarse but steady. At last, with a mighty heave, Rosie got her feet beneath her. The family let out a ragged cheer. Jack didn't let go, holding her steady as Margaret checked for swelling and cuts. Miraculously, nothing seemed broken. Still, the mare swayed, exhausted. Dr. Clayton's headlights cut through the night. He moved quickly, examining Rosie, nodding in approval at their makeshift rescue. "You did good," he said, voice grim but kind. "She'll need to rest, keep her warm and dry, and watch for signs of labor." Jack and Lila worked through the night, rubbing Rosie down, swapping out wet blankets for dry ones, speaking to her in soothing tones. Margaret brewed coffee and stood vigil by the stall, her expression tight with worry. The storm raged on, thunder rattling the rafters. As dawn crept over the sodden hills, Rosie's breathing eased. She nibbled at a handful of hay Lila offered, eyes drooping in exhaustion. Jack sat with her, too tired to stand, his hand resting on her neck. The crisis had passed, but the fear lingered. The family gathered in the kitchen, silent and haggard, every one of them shaken. Margaret put a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You kept your promise. You didn't give up." Jack nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't either. The next days were marked by careful vigilance. Jack missed sleep, barely leaving the barn except for meals. Margaret called the vet more often, and Lila stayed home from her summer job to help with chores. Every shadow seemed a threat, every twitch from Rosie a reason to worry. But amid the tension, there were moments of hope. Rosie, recovering from her ordeal, began to accept Jack's presence with a trust deeper than ever before. She would lean against him as he brushed her, her eyes closing in quiet relief. Jack started reading to her again at night, his voice filling the barn with stories of mustangs and wild valleys. The storm had left its mark, but it hadn't broken them. If anything, the family was more united, by fear, by hope, and by their refusal to let go. Willow Creek Ranch, for all its troubles, still pulsed with stubborn life. And as spring turned toward summer, the threat that hung over Rosie and her unborn foals seemed both closer and farther away, like thunder on the horizon, always waiting, but not yet here. The weeks following the storm brought a tense calm to Willow Creek Ranch. Rosie's ordeal had shaken the whole family, and though she'd survived, everyone knew how fragile her condition was. Margaret moved through her days with a new heaviness, shoulders squared against invisible burdens. The expenses piled up. Vet visits, extra feed, repairs to the paddock after the storm, all while the market price for their beef cattle dropped again. Jack kept up his relentless vigil, sleeping more often in the barn than his own bed. He watched Rosie's every movement with the intensity of someone who feared disaster with every breath. The once joyful routines of ranch life now felt like they hung by a thread. One gray morning, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, bills spread before her in neat, ominous rows. She tapped her pen against the ledger, lips pressed thin, adding and subtracting numbers that never seemed to come out right. Lila hovered nearby, hands stuffed in her pockets, wanting to help but not knowing how. "Jack's out with Rosie again?" Margaret asked, voice clipped. Lila nodded. "He barely eats, Mom. He's so worried. He acts like Rosie's all that matters." Margaret's expression softened, but only for a moment. "Rosie's important. But this ranch is more than just one horse, Lila." Lila sat down across from her mother, looking out the window toward the distant barn. "Jack's different since Dad passed. Rosie's all he's got sometimes." Margaret looked at her daughter, the years weighing on her face. "Rosie's not all he's got. He's got us." The truth of it hung in the air, unspoken. They all missed the old days, when Jack's father would whistle as he fixed the tractor, when Rosie was still a playful filly, when there wasn't a constant ache of fear that something else would go wrong. Jack barely noticed the tension swirling inside the house. His world had shrunk to the barn, Rosie, and the faint hope that somehow things would work out. Each night, as the wind rattled the old wood and coyotes yipped in the distance, Jack found comfort in Rosie's steady presence. She'd lean against the stall, her breath slow and deep, eyes finding him through the shadows. He talked to her about everything: the stress, the ranch, his dreams, and regrets. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, girl," he whispered one night, his hand resting on her sweat-dampened neck. "But I'm not giving up on you. I just can't." The days grew warmer, the air humming with the promise of summer. But with each passing week, Rosie's struggles grew more obvious. Her belly swelled, her gait slowed, and her appetite faded even further. Jack spent hours coaxing her to eat, trying every trick Margaret could think of. Sweet molasses mash, slices of apple, fresh grass from the upper pasture. Some days, Rosie only picked at her food, eyes clouded with exhaustion. Margaret's worry turned to frustration. She called Dr. Clayton nearly every other day, desperate for reassurance or some new advice. The vet's answers never changed. Keep Rosie comfortable, monitor her closely, be ready for anything. One evening, after a tense family dinner, Margaret pushed her chair back with a sigh. "I can't do this much longer," she said, voice trembling. "The bills, the worry, the not knowing if Rosie's going to make it. Sometimes I think we're all fools for hoping." Jack met her gaze, jaw set. "Rosie's still fighting, Mom. We can't give up now." Margaret slammed her hand on the table, startling Lila. "And what if it costs us everything, Jack? The ranch, our home, your future?" Jack's anger flared, but instead of yelling, he turned and walked out, boots echoing on the porch. He made his way to the barn, blinking back tears he refused to shed. Inside, Rosie stood quietly, as if waiting for him. Jack pressed his forehead to her neck. "It's getting harder, Rosie. I know you're tired. I am too. The barn filled with silence, broken only by Rosie's deep, steady breathing. Jack felt her warm breath on his shoulder, her soft muzzle pressing gently into his chest. For a moment, he let himself lean into her, drawing comfort from the simple, ancient bond between horse and human. Suddenly, Rosie shifted, turning her neck in an almost awkward gesture. Her head pressed against Jack's side, not just nuzzling, but wrapping her long neck around him in a way she'd never done before. Jack froze, surprised by the unexpected embrace. He felt the strength of her, the determination, and something loosened inside him. He looked into her eyes, wet with emotion. "Thank you, Rosie. I needed that." Lila peeked in from the doorway, saw the moment, and smiled softly. She tiptoed back to the house, heart lighter than it had been in weeks. That night, Jack sat in the barn long after everyone else had gone to bed. He thought of his father, the old stories of wild horses and impossible odds. He thought of Margaret, fighting to keep the family together, even when it seemed hopeless. And he thought of Rosie, still standing, still trying, refusing to give in. As the moonlight spilled through the cracks in the barn, Jack made a silent vow. No matter what happened next, he'd stay by Rosie's side. He'd fight for her, for the twins, and for Willow Creek Ranch. Because family, in all its stubborn, fragile forms, was worth it. And somewhere in the dark, Rosie shifted closer, her soft breath a reminder that even in the hardest times, hope could be found in the smallest gestures. A nuzzle, a hug, a promise kept through the night. The air was thick and electric that evening, the clouds roiling low over Willow Creek Ranch. All day the animals had been restless, cows bunching along the fence line, chickens silent in the coop. Even the barn cats vanished to high beams and shadowed corners. Margaret felt it in her bones, the old ache warning her of weather and worry, and she kept glancing toward the horizon as she finished evening chores. Inside the barn, Jack lingered by Rosie's stall, running a brush over her sweat-dampened coat. She'd grown heavy and slow, her breathing shallow. He kept one hand on her flank, feeling the tremble beneath her skin, a subtle rhythm that set his own heart pounding. Margaret poked her head in. "Storm's coming fast, Jack. You oughta—" She stopped, frowning. "What's wrong with Rosie?" Jack's voice was tense. "She's not herself, Mom. She keeps shifting, lying down and standing up again. And she hasn't touched her supper." Margaret's face paled. "You think—" Jack didn't answer. He reached for his phone, but as he dialed Dr. Clayton, the sky outside split open, thunder booming so loud the barn rattled. Wind roared, flinging rain sideways against the tin roof. The power flickered, then died, plunging the ranch into sudden darkness. Lila burst into the barn, flashlight beam wild. "Lights are out everywhere. Should I run to the generator?" Margaret shook her head, voice calm but urgent. "Forget the generator. Bring every candle and lantern you can find, and fetch the birthing kit from the tack room. Now." Jack's hands shook as he guided Rosie into the fresh straw Margaret had spread that afternoon. Lightning flashed, illuminating Rosie's wide eyes and quivering muscles. She let out a long, low moan that twisted Jack's stomach into knots. Lila dashed back with a box of candles, matches, towels, and rolls of gauze. Margaret set about lighting the lanterns, her hands steady despite the storm raging outside. "Jack, talk to her," she ordered. "Keep her calm. I'll prep the towels." Rain hammered the barn roof, leaking through old seams. The horses stamped in their stalls, the scent of fear thick in the air. Jack knelt by Rosie's head, stroking her jaw, whispering, "It's okay, girl. We're right here. You're not alone." Minutes dragged by, stretched taut as wire. Rosie's labor came on fast, each contraction stronger than the last. Sweat darkened her copper coat, and she struggled to stand, then collapsed again. The wind shrieked, thunder shaking the rafters, but all Jack could hear was Rosie's ragged breathing. Margaret called Dr. Clayton, voice trembling with urgency. "She's in labor, twins. Yes. Now, power's out. We'll keep you updated." She hung up, face grim. "He'll get here as soon as he can, but the road's flooded. We're on our own for now." Jack swallowed hard. The barn glowed with candlelight and hope. Margaret moving like a general, Lila wringing her hands by the stall door. Jack tried to remember everything he'd learned. Breathe, stay calm, trust Rosie. But as hours passed, worry gnawed at him. Rosie was growing weaker, her breaths shorter. Then, with a mighty push and a guttural cry, Rosie delivered the first foal. Margaret moved fast, hands gentle but sure. "It's a colt," she breathed, pulling the slick, trembling shape into the light. "Jack, get towels." Jack wrapped the colt in soft cotton, rubbing his sides, clearing his nose and mouth. The little one, deep red like Rosie, long-legged and strong, let out a squeal that filled the barn. Jack felt his heart leap. "He's alive! Look! Rosie, he's here!" Margaret's face shone with sweat and tears. "Name him," she said, voice cracking. Jack grinned, tears running down his face. "Cedar. He's strong as the old trees on the ridge." But there was no time for celebration. Rosie's sides heaved again, and her legs buckled. "She's not done," Margaret warned. "The filly's coming." The storm outside raged harder, wind howling, power lines snapping somewhere in the distance. Lila pressed towels against Rosie's flank, whispering prayers under her breath. The second foal came slowly, painfully, far weaker than Cedar. She slipped into Jack's hands, limp and silent, her coat pale and cold. Jack's heart twisted. "Come on, little one. Come on." Margaret wiped the filly's nose, but she didn't stir. Jack cradled her tiny head, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Don't you give up, please!" The barn was a world apart, thunder and fear pressing close. Jack worked furiously, rubbing the filly's chest, blowing softly into her nose, willing her to breathe. Margaret brought warm water, towels, anything she could think of, but the filly lay still, hunts felt like hours. Lila wept quietly in the shadows, Margaret squeezing Jack's shoulder. "Let her go, son," she whispered. "You did all you could." But Jack shook his head, determination flaring. "No, she's got Rosie's heart. She just needs more time." He held the filly close, wrapping her in blankets, massaging her chest, whispering words of hope. Rosie turned her head, touching the filly's nose with her own, as if willing life into her. Then, faint and fragile, the filly shuddered, a tiny gasp of breath rattling in her chest. Jack froze. Margaret leaned in, holding her breath. The filly gasped again, louder this time, then blinked, dark eyes meeting Jack's. A miracle, small and trembling and real. Lila let out a cry, rushing to Jack's side. Margaret sank to her knees, hands pressed to her lips, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jack cradled the filly, Sage, he named her, for the pale silver green of her coat, against his chest, heart pounding with joy and fear and awe. The storm raged on, but in the flickering candlelight of the old barn, a family clung together around Rosie and her twins, holding hope, holding each other, as a new chapter began beneath the thunder and the rain. Dawn broke pale and trembling over Willow Creek Ranch, painting the sodden fields in a soft gold. The storm had passed, leaving puddles in the rutted drive and broken branches scattered across the pasture. But inside the barn, time felt suspended. The family huddled in the warm, hay-scented gloom, exhaustion etched into their faces. Yet, in that quiet space, a miracle was unfolding. Sage, the tiny filly no one thought would survive, stirred in Jack's arms. He hadn't slept, barely dared to breathe, afraid she would slip away as suddenly as she'd arrived. He'd kept her wrapped in blankets, holding her against his chest, willing his warmth into her shivering body. Margaret dozed against a hay bale, one hand resting on Rosie's neck. Lila sat nearby, hugging her knees, watching the first rays of light creep across the barn floor. Jack felt a faint flutter, a tiny heartbeat, fragile but stubborn, beneath his palm. Sage's eyelids fluttered open, her breath quivering in the still air. He looked up, hope flooding his face. She's alive. She made it. Margaret blinked awake, relief and disbelief mingling in her eyes. She hurried over, gently stroking Sage's neck, checking her pulse and temperature with practiced hands. It's a miracle. She's really here. Rosie, weak but alert, turned her head, nuzzling both her foals in turn. Cedar stood on wobbly legs, his curiosity already outpacing his strength, while Sage remained tucked in Jack's arms, blinking at the new world around her. Lila let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her cheeks. I can't believe it. Both of them. Both. The barn filled with soft, amazed laughter. The kind that comes after a long night when the world feels new and anything seems possible. Outside, the sun climbed higher, banishing the last of the shadows. Word spread fast, as it always did in small towns. Dr. Clayton arrived by noon, mud caked on his boots, fatigue etched into every line of his face. But when he saw Sage alive, alert, and breathing, his professional composure cracked. I've been doing this 30 years, he murmured, eyes shining, and I've never seen a tougher bunch, horse or human. Margaret hugged him, tears in her eyes. Lila snapped photos of the twins, her phone buzzing with messages from friends and neighbors. Jack smiled for the first time in weeks, the weight in his chest finally lifting. The family worked in shifts to care for Rosie and her foals. Cedar learned to nurse quickly, hungry and insistent, his legs growing steadier with each hour. Sage was more delicate, needing to be bottle-fed at first, but her strength grew day by day. Margaret mixed special formula, Lila kept detailed notes, and Jack hardly left their side, catching sleep in brief, grateful snatches. One afternoon, Jack took a photo of Rosie and her twins, Cedar bold and steady, Sage curled close to her mother, Rosie watching over them with gentle eyes. On a whim, he posted it online with a short note. Against all odds, Rosie, Cedar, and Sage, born in last night's storm. He thought nothing of it, just wanting to share hope with the world. But something about the story, struggle, survival, the stubborn hope of a ranching family, resonated far beyond Willow Creek. Within hours, the post was shared hundreds of times, then thousands. Messages flooded in from all over the country, words of encouragement, offers of help, stories of other animals who'd survived the odds. By evening, a local reporter showed up at the ranch gate, boots muddy, notebook in hand. We heard about the miracle twins, she said, grinning. Would you mind sharing your story? Margaret hesitated, but Jack nodded. If it gives people hope, I'm all for it. The reporter snapped photos of the twins, interviewed Margaret and Jack, and scribbled notes as Lila described the harrowing night of the storm. The story ran in the next day's paper, front page with a picture of Rosie nuzzling Cedar and Sage. The phone rang off the hook. Neighbors dropped by with homemade casseroles, bales of hay, and wide-eyed children eager to meet the famous twins. People sent letters, emails, and small donations to help cover the mounting vet bills. Jack was overwhelmed by the kindness. He'd never been comfortable in the spotlight, but seeing the way Sage and Cedar lit up people's faces made the chaos worthwhile. For the first time in a long while, Willow Creek buzzed with hope and laughter instead of worry. As days turned to weeks, Cedar and Sage each revealed their personalities. Cedar was bold, quick to explore, and loved to pester his mother. He tried to climb over everything: straw bales, Lila's legs, even Jack's boots, earning the nickname Little Outlaw. Sage was gentle and watchful, content to curl up in the sun or lean against Rosie for comfort. She followed Cedar everywhere, but when the barn filled with strangers, she'd stick close to Jack, pressing her nose into his palm until he whispered that everything was all right. The ranch became a place of pilgrimage. Families brought their children, teachers asked if their classes could visit, and local vets sent students to learn from Rosie's extraordinary case. Jack and Lila started giving impromptu tours, sharing the story and teaching visitors about animal care and resilience. One Saturday, a group of scientists arrived from the state university, eager to document the rare twin birth and monitor the foal's development. Margaret looked overwhelmed, but Jack laughed, happy to share what he'd learned. "We didn't do anything special," he insisted, "just gave them a chance. That's all any of us can do." At sunset, as the visitors departed and the family finally found a moment of quiet, Jack sat in the paddock, Rosie's head in his lap, Cedar and Sage dozing at her side. The ranch glowed gold and peaceful under the endless western sky. Jack looked up, heart full. Against all odds, they'd made it. And in that moment, with his family whole and the world watching, Jack knew. The hardest nights sometimes bring the brightest mornings. The weeks after Rosie's miracle birth brought a new kind of energy to Willow Creek Ranch, a restless, bright excitement that felt nothing like the tense worry of months past. Where once Jack and Margaret had moved through their days with quiet determination and fear, now there was laughter in the kitchen, music from Lila's speaker drifting out over the fields, and the constant, joyful sound of visitors at the gate. Word of the twins had traveled far and wide. The story of Rosie, Cedar, and Sage was picked up by national news outlets. Local papers published updates, and people sent cards and gifts from states Jack had only ever seen on TV. There were hand-knitted blankets from Minnesota, paintings from schoolchildren in Dallas, and even a homemade halter embroidered with Miracle Mare in looping gold letters. It wasn't just the mail that changed. Strangers began arriving at the ranch, hoping for a glimpse of Rosie and her foals. Margaret was wary at first, but when she saw the hope in people's eyes, children in wheelchairs, elderly couples holding hands, exhausted parents seeking a break from their own worries, she understood. These people came for more than a curiosity. They came for proof that sometimes the impossible was real. So Margaret organized open days. Every Saturday, the family set up a shaded tent by the paddock, brewed lemonade, and gave tours. Lila led the children on scavenger hunts to find wildflowers or watch Cedar chase his own tail, while Jack showed visitors how to brush Rosie and bottle feed Sage. Cedar, bold and rambunctious, relished the attention. He'd prance and buck for the crowds, soaking up every laugh and round of applause. When a child with braces on her legs approached the fence, Cedar pressed his nose against her hand, then followed her along the rails, careful and gentle. The moment made headlines. Miracle Colt brings joy to young fan. Sage was quieter, more sensitive to the flood of new faces and voices. During tours, she often stayed close to Rosie or watched from the shade. Jack noticed how Sage would slip away from the crowd to find him, pressing her nose against his chest until he crouched beside her and whispered calming words. Jack worried sometimes about all the attention. He'd never wanted the ranch to feel like a zoo. But every evening, as the sun set over the hills and the visitors packed up their picnic baskets, he'd find Rosie and the twins content, exhausted but safe. It seemed as if Rosie understood her story meant something now to the world beyond Willow Creek. The family's life changed in other ways, too. Local schools called to schedule field trips, teachers hoping their students could witness resilience up close. Lila loved these visits. She'd turn every lesson into an adventure, from naming parts of the horse to explaining why hope mattered more than odds. Jack taught older kids how to muck stalls or repair fences, joking that it's all about patience and good boots. Margaret, long accustomed to doing everything herself, learned to delegate. She accepted help from neighbors and donated extra eggs and vegetables to the food pantry in town. People gave to us when we needed it, she told Jack. Now it's our turn. One morning, a black van rolled up the gravel drive and parked by the barn. A crew of documentary filmmakers stepped out, lugging cameras and microphones. The lead producer, a cheerful woman named Kelly, explained that their network wanted to make a special about the miracle twins and the people who'd believed in them. Jack was nervous, but Margaret was gracious. If our story gives someone hope, it's worth telling. For a week, the cameras followed the family's every move: morning chores, feeding time, vet checkups, and the quiet moments at dusk when Rosie nuzzled her foals and Jack sang softly to the herd. Kelly interviewed Jack about his decision to trust Rosie, about the night of the storm, and what it meant to see both foals alive. Jack hesitated, not used to talking about feelings. I guess sometimes you have to believe in something before you can see it, even when you're scared, especially then. The documentary crew captured everything: the laughter, the mess, the days when Sage wouldn't eat or Cedar got into the feed bin and left oats everywhere. They filmed Margaret baking bread, Lila sketching in the sun, and Jack fixing a broken fence while Cedar watched, imitating every move. The attention brought joy, but also strain. There were early mornings, endless phone calls, the pressure of always being on for the cameras and the crowds. Jack grew protective of Rosie, sometimes turning away visitors when she seemed tired. He worried about Sage, who was still more fragile than her brother, and checked her temperature and appetite twice as often as the vet suggested. Some nights, after the ranch was quiet again, Jack would sit alone in the barn. He'd stroke Rosie's neck and whisper, "I know this is a lot, girl. But you're not just ours anymore. You belong to all those folks out there who needed something to believe in." One evening, Margaret joined him, sitting beside Rosie's stall. "You've given a lot of people hope, Jack. That matters." He nodded, thoughtful. "But we need to protect what matters most, too." Margaret squeezed his hand. "We will. This ranch stands for second chances. Yours, mine, Rosie's. The world can learn from that, but only if we keep our hearts right here." As summer ripened and the hills blazed gold under the July sun, Cedar and Sage grew strong and sure. Cedar was all wild energy and mischief, Sage, graceful and gentle, watched and learned, never far from Rosie's side. Together they brought the world to Willow Creek, and Willow Creek to the world. But fame brought new challenges, too, and Jack knew peace couldn't last forever. As the ranch's story spread, he could feel the pressure mounting, like thunder rumbling far off, waiting to break once more. Still, under the vast sky, with Rosie and her twins dozing in the dusk, Jack found a moment's peace. No matter what came next, Willow Creek would always be home, a place where hope and courage were born anew with every sunrise. The long days of summer faded into a softer, golden autumn at Willow Creek Ranch. The open days had slowed, and the camera crews packed their gear, but the story of Rosie and her miracle twins still lingered. Drawing a trickle of hopeful visitors each week, Cedar and Sage, now several months old, grew into their personalities. Cedar bold and spirited, Sage gentle and thoughtful, never far from her brother's side. Jack began to settle into a new rhythm. Each morning, he'd find the twins waiting by the gate, eager for breakfast and the first run of the day. Rosie, stronger with every week, kept a careful watch over both, and the family found peace in the ordinary. Fixing fences, gathering eggs, teaching children from the local school how to hold a brush or offer a carrot in an open palm. But as the leaves turned and the winds cooled, whispers of trouble came riding in with the mailman and over the feed store counter. Equine influenza had been spotted up the road, a fast-moving, highly contagious virus that had swept through ranches in the next county. Jack listened with a growing sense of dread as Dr. Clayton called one afternoon with news. "We've got to be careful, Jack," the vet warned. "Horses are coming down sick all over. Fever, cough, runny noses, the works. Quarantine anyone new. No visitors, and keep a close eye on Rosie and the foals." Jack relayed the message to Margaret, who acted fast. She canceled all tours, locked the main gate, and posted a handwritten sign. "No entry, quarantine." Lila spread the word online, and the neighbors respected their wishes. But the unease hung over the ranch like the fog that rolled in before dawn. For days, all seemed well. Jack sanitized every bucket, washed his hands until they were raw, and kept Cedar and Sage away from the fence line. He thought, maybe, just maybe, they'd be spared. But one crisp morning, as the sun barely crested the hills, Jack knew something was wrong. Cedar, usually the first to race and buck at daybreak, stood listless in the far corner of the paddock. His head drooped, and he wouldn't touch his breakfast. When Jack pressed a hand to his muzzle, he found it hot, dry, and trembling. Margaret rushed to call Dr. Clayton, her voice tight with fear. Lila fetched a blanket, her hands shaking. "He's burning up, Jack. He won't even nuzzle Rosie." Jack's heart twisted. "Get the thermometer. Sage, come here, girl." Sage, sensing the shift, hovered at Cedar's side, her soft eyes wide with worry. Rosie snorted anxiously, pacing the stall. Dr. Clayton arrived in record time, his truck still dusted with hay and dirt from the morning rounds. He checked Cedar's temperature, listened to his chest, and shook his head grimly. "He's caught the flu. Best thing is isolation. Move him to the quarantine stall, keep him warm, hydrated. It's going to be a tough few days." They moved Cedar to the far end of the barn, setting up fresh straw and rigging heat lamps. Jack stayed by his side, offering water every hour, rubbing the colt's neck, coaxing him to take even a mouthful of food. Cedar's breathing grew rough, his eyes dull with fever. Margaret and Lila took shifts, bringing towels, soup for Jack, and messages from neighbors who called with prayers and offers to help. But the ranch felt suddenly empty. No laughter, no tours, no school kids waving at the gate. Just the soft sounds of Sage pacing outside Cedar's stall, her nose pressed to the window every time Jack stepped away. At night, Jack sat on a crate by Cedar's head, listening to the labored breaths, fighting exhaustion and fear. "Stay with me, boy," he whispered. "We've been through worse. Remember that storm? You're stronger than this." Sage, refusing to leave her brother, found ways to help. She'd stand by the barn window, pawing at the boards until Jack opened it, then lean her head inside and whicker softly, as if urging Cedar not to give up. When Cedar moaned, Sage would nose a mouthful of hay toward him or simply stand guard, eyes never leaving her brother. The days blurred together. Thermometer readings, rounds of medicine, endless waiting. Rosie grew anxious, pacing the paddock, calling to her son. Margaret took to sitting outside Cedar's stall, reading to both foals from Jack's old storybooks, her voice soft and steady even when her hands shook. Lila documented everything, sending updates to friends and followers who'd grown invested in the twins. "Keep hoping," she wrote. "Cedar is fighting. Sage won't leave him. Rosie is watching over them all." Jack's sense of helplessness deepened each time Cedar refused food or drifted into a fevered sleep. He worried for Sage, too, her refusal to rest, her constant vigil. The pressure of it all, the fear, the attention, the burden of hope, threatened to break him. One night, as rain pattered on the roof and Cedar's breathing rattled louder than ever, Jack found himself talking to Rosie. "I don't know if I can do this again," he said softly, stroking her mane. "He's just a colt, but he means everything to us. I wish I knew if he'd make it." Rosie touched his cheek with her soft muzzle, as if offering comfort she could not voice. Jack stayed there, shoulders shaking, until Sage came to nuzzle his arm. He gathered himself, forced a smile, and returned to Cedar's stall. Then, late one night, Cedar began to stir. His breathing eased, and he managed a feeble nuzzle at Jack's hand. Sage, standing guard, let out a hopeful whinny, answered by Rosie across the barn. Margaret and Lila, woken by the noise, joined Jack in a circle around Cedar. The fever finally broke at sunrise, sweat slicking his red coat, his eyes brightening at last. As news spread that Cedar had survived, the community rallied around the ranch. Food arrived at the gate, along with handmade cards and flowers. Neighbors left stacks of hay, homemade cookies, even knitted blankets for the twins. For the first time in days, hope felt real again. Earned, battered, but unbroken. The threat of crisis had returned, but so had the proof. Willow Creek Ranch and the family at its heart would face whatever came, together. The morning Cedar's fever finally broke. Sunlight poured through the barn windows, warm and golden, filling every dusty corner with the promise of new beginnings. Jack sat cross-legged in the straw, Sage curled up on one side of him, Rosie on the other. Cedar, still weak but alert, lay with his head in Jack's lap, blinking at the familiar faces that gathered around him. Margaret let out a shaky breath, hands clasped tight over her heart. Lila knelt nearby, beaming, tears shining in her eyes. "He made it, Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking with relief and awe. "He's really going to be okay." Jack smiled, his exhaustion melting away, replaced by a lightness he hadn't felt in months. "We all did, together." Rosie nuzzled Cedar's side, then lifted her nose to Jack's cheek. as if she knew just how close she'd come to losing one of her own. For a long while, the family simply stayed there, a silent circle of gratitude and love, letting the warmth of survival settle into their bones. When Dr. Clayton arrived, he found a barn full of joy. He checked Cedar's pulse, then Sage's, and gave Rosie a thorough once-over. "You've done what most folks only dream of," he said, shaking Jack's hand with real pride. All three safe, strong, and whole. Outside, the news spread quickly. The community that had rallied during Cedar's sickness now celebrated in kind. Baskets of wildflowers appeared at the ranch gate. Neighbors honked their horns as they drove by. Children painted signs and pinned them to the fence. Messages from around the country poured in. Stories of hope, recovery, and second chances inspired by Rosie's miracle family. With Cedar recovering and Sage always at his side, the family finally exhaled. The ranch returned to its familiar, steady rhythm, feeding cattle, repairing fences, checking the orchard, and caring for the animals. But everything felt changed, deeper somehow. Every sunset, every laughter-filled dinner, every quiet moment between storms seemed sharper, more precious. It was Lila who first suggested the idea that would become their next adventure. She watched Jack tell Rosie's story to a group of wide-eyed children one afternoon and said, "People need to hear what we've been through, Jack. Not just for the fame, but because it matters. Maybe we could write it all down, a book, something folks can carry with them, even after the news cameras are gone." Jack hesitated at first, never thinking of himself as a writer, but Margaret agreed. "We have a duty to share what hope looks like, especially when the world feels like it's falling apart." So over the winter, the family gathered by the fire, passing around an old spiral notebook, each taking turns writing memories, lessons, and the small moments that kept them going. Jack wrote about the quiet bond between man and horse. Margaret about the fierce, sometimes painful love of a mother, and Lila about the power of believing in miracles, even on the darkest nights. The book became more than just a family project. Local teachers asked for copies to use in their classrooms. A small publisher in town offered to print it. People wrote back, sharing how Rosie's story helped them get through their own storms: a sick child, a lost job, a failing crop. The ranch was no longer just their home. It had become a beacon for anyone who needed to believe in second chances. Meanwhile, Rosie and her twins continued to capture hearts far beyond Willow Creek. Cedar grew into a bold, beautiful gelding, known for his mischievous streak and boundless energy. Sage remained gentle and wise, always watching, always near her mother or brother. Rosie, the copper mare at the heart of it all, led the herd with quiet dignity. As spring returned and wildflowers blanketed the hills, Willow Creek Ranch blossomed too. School groups visited to learn about animal care, responsibility, and the courage to hope. Jack and Lila spoke at local events, their nerves fading as they realized people weren't just curious about the twins. They were inspired by the strength of family, perseverance, and love. A documentary crew returned to film an update. This time, there was less fear and more laughter. They captured Jack leading Cedar and Sage along the river, Margaret explaining how she'd rebuilt the ranch after hardship, Lila showing children how to braid Sage's mane. The crew's final shot was at sunset, Rosie standing at the crest of the hill, Cedar and Sage at her side, the family silhouetted against the wide-open sky. That evening, after the cameras were gone and the visitors had left, Jack wandered out to the pasture. He found Rosie grazing in the fading light, Sage dozing nearby. Cedar kicking playfully at the last of the wildflowers. He leaned against the fence, the scent of grass and summer in the air, and let himself remember everything they'd survived. The storms, the heartbreak, the miracles. Margaret joined him, wrapping an arm around his waist. "We made it, Jack. Not just through the hard times, but to something better. This ranch is more than land. It's our story, our legacy." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I never knew how strong we were until we had to be." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to see what matters most. And sometimes, hope is just a stubborn promise you keep making until the sun comes out again." As dusk settled over Willow Creek, Jack sat by Rosie's side, watching Cedar and Sage play in the fading light. He felt the weight of all they'd been through. But more than that, he felt the deep, unshakable joy of knowing they'd done it together. Their story, born from fear and forged in love, would live on, lighting the way for anyone who dared to believe in miracles, family, and the power of second chances. And as the stars blinked awake above the old ranch, Jack whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for survival, but for the legacy of hope they'd built, one dawn at a time.